Welcome to Leave No Warrior Behind. Oh, wait, I think I'm going to need my glasses. Okie dokie. So we're going to do a little land acknowledgement. The Penn Museum is respectfully acknowledges that it is situated on Lenapehoking, the ancestral and spiritual homeland of the Unami Lenape. So the Lenape homeland is all around us, preserved especially in the place names of our region. So when you think about Susquehanna, Manayunk, Shakamakson, Tulpehocken, Wissahickon, and so on. And so welcome. My name is Kimberly Max Brown. I'm the Executive Director of Eternal Soldier, and I will be your moderator for today. So we are just so delighted to have you here for this discussion, and I'm going to give you a little bit of what to expect today. So I'm going to take you through our partners, and then because that partnership is what made this event possible, and then I'll make some very brief remarks, and then I'll turn things directly over to our panelists who are going to make some presentations about their understanding and experience with battlefield recovery. And then finally, we'll move on to a Q&A. And so as you can see here, these are all of our partners. And so the Penn Museum was founded in 1887 and houses over 1 million artifacts. So, and the specialization of the museum is the study of humans and human culture, past and present. All right, I would say that it is also one of the unique institutions of its kind in the country, meaning that it's both focused on excavation and fieldwork and active research. The Penn Museum offers admission every day for active duty military and veterans. So all you need to do is show your veteran card and you'll be admitted for free. And the museum is also a Blue Star Museum, meaning that in the summers, veterans and their families can be admitted for free. And then we want you to know that there are programs at the museum for all ages. And so if you're able to sign up for the museum's newsletter, you can hear about all the amazing activities that happen in this building. The Penn Office of Affirmative Action and Equal Opportunity is also there we go. It's also the home of the Penn Veterans Collaborative. And so the office, the OAA EOP, provides leadership and support for the university's efforts to achieve and maintain a work environment that is diverse in race, ethnicity, interests, abilities, and perspectives. And the office ensures the implementation of equal opportunity, affirmative action, and non-discrimination policies through education, training, and active partnerships with others around the campus and around Philadelphia. Next is our partner at Drexel, the Office of Veteran and Military Services, Military and Veteran Services. And the center is renowned for its service to military and dedication to educating veterans. You can see here some of their achievements. Yellow Ribbon School since 2009, over 600 veterans and military dependents enrolled currently, nationally ranked military-friendly school, the Student Veterans Association, which I can attest is really cool and powerful and a great voice in the community, Veterans Colleague Resource Group, Veterans Alumni Network, and the Mashi Student Veterans Lounge. And finally, we come to Eternal Soldier. So Eternal Soldier runs a variety of programs. Right now, we're running Homer and Beyond, which is a veterans workshop where we read literature that is either Homer itself or that is related to Homer. We also have run a theater workshop for veterans where we engaged veterans in dramatic readings, which they performed virtually because this was during the pandemic. We also offer museum tours, and we are available to visit your VFW or your American Legion post to talk about our work with veterans here at the museum. And also, our most recent opportunity was an archaeology day for veterans, which occurred this June. It was an incredible opportunity. And so you can check us out on our website at www.eternalsoldier.org. So what are we going to be doing today? So we're going to have a conversation about the imperative to retrieve the fallen and the wounded from the battlefield. What does it take to do it? What kind of courage, what kind of leadership are we talking about? Because Veterans Day is upon us, we also want to honor the sacrifices that this type of work entails. So we're all going to look back over the centuries at what we know about this effort. And then we're also going to talk about some episodes that we know about from our modern lives. Today, we're going to look at something that you're probably familiar with, which is the Trojan War. And then we have a panelist who's going to look back at the Battle of Mogadishu. This year is the 30th anniversary of that battle. And then for an even more recent perspective, we will be talking about how recovery operated in OEF, Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. And so overall, I think our point today is that we're going to have an opportunity to look at what's unique to each of these episodes. You know, there's different ethics, there's personalities, there's technology involved that's different. But at the same time, we're going to think about what these episodes have in common, because I also think that that is a useful frame of reference for us. So without further ado, I want to bring up our first panelist, and that is Dr. Sheila Murnahan, right? Have a little information about her here. Dr. Murnahan is a professor of classical studies here at the University of Pennsylvania. The main areas of her research and teaching are Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, tragic drama, gender and classical culture, and modern reuses of classical literature. Her principal current project is a commentary on Sophocles' Ajax, and she is also the author of a new translation of Euripides' Medea and Sophocles' Antigone. And she is also, thankfully, my partner as one of the facilitators of the Homer and Beyond Veterans Read Homer book group, sponsored by Penn's Eternal Soldier program. So I want to welcome Sheila Murnahan to the stage. Thank you.
Thank you, Max, for that introduction. And I just want to start by saying what a privilege it has been for me to be involved in Eternal Soldier, and how very much I have learned from the opportunity to interact with people who have direct experience of situations that I know only from reading about them in ancient texts. And I'm very honored to be here today to participate in this program along such incredibly impressive and distinguished co-panelists. What happened to the bodies of warriors killed in battle was a major concern in the ancient Greek world. Efforts were regularly made to assure that the fallen were properly buried, typically in communal graves at the site of battle, and that they were publicly mourned and honored. In the poetic performances that recounted the shared myths that were the shared property of that culture, whether epic narratives like Homer's Iliad and Odyssey or tragic drama, and these were the media through which the Greeks processed their experiences, much as we do today through films like Black Hawk Down. In those poems, proper burial of the dead is a prominent theme, and whether a body gets buried or not is often an important plot point. Failure to be buried is not just a misfortune, but a source of horror and humiliation. And this is clear already in the opening lines of the Iliad. The Iliad is our earliest surviving work of Greek literature, and it is a poem about war, describing in great detail a particular 50-day period in the legendary Trojan War. This is the war when the Greeks sailed across the Aegean Sea to the coast of what is now Turkey and besieged the city of Troy. The great Greek hero Achilles, immediately at the beginning of the poem, becomes angry at his commander Agamemnon and refuses to fight any longer, with the result that many men on his own side end up dying. And the poet opens the poem by calling on the muse as he lays out the subject of his poem. Rage. Sing, goddess, Achilles' rage, black and murderous, that cost the Greeks incalculable pain, pitched countless souls of heroes into Hades' dark, and left their bodies to rot as feasts for dogs and birds, as Zeus's will was done. The pain caused by these many deaths is magnified by the extreme dehumanization that happens when people's bodies become food for animals. Consequently, preventing the enemy from recovering a dead man's body and giving it a proper burial becomes a prized way of extending the triumph of having killed him. We see this in the taunts that warriors hurl at their victims, as in this instance, when the Greek warrior Odysseus overtakes and kills a minor Trojan warrior, Socus, who is fleeing from the battle. Ah, Socus, death was too quick for you, and you couldn't dodge it. Your parents will not close your eyes on a bier. No, Birds will eat your flesh raw, fanning their wings. But if I die, the Greeks will give me burial. The humiliating treatment of dead enemies is taken to a new level when Achilles returns to the war, drawn back by the timeless and paramount motivation for fighting, revenge for death of a close companion. He goes after the Trojan prince Hector, who has killed his best friend Patroclus. And when he has succeeded in killing Hector, he subjects Hector's body to extreme abuse. But it was shame and defilement Achilles had in mind for Hector. He pierced the tendons above the heels and cinched them with leather thongs to his chariot, letting Hector's head drag. He mounted, hoisted up his prize armor, and whipped his team to a willing gallop across the plain. A cloud of dust arose where Hector was hauled, and the long black hair fanned out from his head, so beautiful once, as it trailed in the dust. And the cruelty of this treatment is increased by the fact that it is happening right under the eyes of Hector's parents. Watching this from the wall, Hector's mother tore off her shining veil and screamed, and his old father groaned pitifully. This scene was often depicted in ancient art, and here it is on a Roman mosaic from the 3rd century AD. Achilles keeps doing this to Hector's body day after day, hooking the body up to his chariot and driving it around the walls of Troy. And the plot of the Iliad becomes caught in a kind of endless loop as Achilles keeps taking out his ongoing anger on Hector's corpse. Finally, through an act of enormous courage, Hector's old father Priam approaches Achilles and makes a personal appeal to him. And here's an early 19th century depiction of that scene. Priam manages to get through to Achilles and persuades him to give the body back, at which point the Trojans are able to give Hector a magnificent funeral, and the poem is able to come to a satisfying close. Several of the most famous surviving Greek tragedies have plots that center on whether a certain body should and will be buried. Notably, 2 plays by Sophocles, Antigone, and Ajax, which I'll come back to later. In both of those plays, somebody dies who has turned on his former allies, and they want to punish him by leaving him unburied. In each case, those angry commanders have to learn with difficulty what Achilles also finally understands, which is that as a fellow mortal being, an enemy who has died is entitled to different treatment from an enemy who is still alive. Now, going back to the Iliad, much of that poem consists of scenes of combat, and some of the most ferocious battles are the ones fought over dead bodies, where the dead man's friends have to fight off the enemy in order to get the body off the field. One of the most extensive of these is the battle that takes place over the Greek warrior Patroclus, the beloved friend of Achilles, who dies taking Achilles' place on the battlefield. In describing this, Homer uses a characteristic poetic device, the simile, in which an event in an action of the poem is compared to some other activity. Often an aspect of combat is compared to some more ordinary and productive peacetime pursuit. In this case, as I think you'll see, with a disturbing effect. The day was passing. Men hacked slowly at each other in pain, the sweat from their labor coating their thighs and knees, pooling under their feet, spattering from their arms into their glazed eyes as the 2 armies fought over Achilles' surrogate. A tanner gives his men an oxhide to stretch, having first drenched it in oil. They stand in a circle and pull at it until its moisture is squeezed out by all their tugging, and the oil has a chance to penetrate the taut leather's pores. So too, the tight circle of men on either side, tugging at the corpse, the Trojans with high hopes of dragging it back to Ilion, the Greeks with their own hopes of getting it back to the ships. The Iliad ends before the death of Achilles himself, but in the rich mythological tradition of the Trojan War, the battle that took place over his body was an important moment and especially intense. So that's what this image depicts. And you can see there that Achilles has been felled by an arrow through his ankle, that is to say, defeated by his Achilles' heel. The Greeks do succeed in rescuing Achilles' body from the battlefield through the combined effort of 2 of their greatest warriors, Odysseus and Ajax. Ajax being Achilles' cousin and the next best fighter after him. In many accounts of this episode, there is a kind of division of labor by which Odysseus fights off the Trojans, while Ajax lifts up the body and carries it off the field. In the Odyssey, the other Homeric epic, which is about Odysseus's journey home from Troy, Odysseus looks back at that fight as his greatest moment on the battlefield. He has been blasted by a storm at sea and thinks he's about to drown. And this means that his body will be lost and his death will be unknown and unmarked. At this point, he cries out, lamenting that he didn't die back at Troy. 3 times, 4 times luckier than I were the Greeks who died on Troy's wide plain. If only I had gone down on that day when the air was whistling with Trojan spears in the desperate fight for Achilles' dead body. I would have had a burial then, honored by the army. As it is, I am doomed to a wretched death at sea. Dying on the battlefield would have earned Odysseus the honor of a funeral, and dying while fighting for Achilles' body would have meant dying at a glorious moment of high achievement. Ajax's complementary achievement of carrying Achilles' body off the battlefield was often depicted in Greek art, including in vase paintings. So here is one example, here is another, and we happen to have here in the Penn Museum, so you can all go upstairs and see it in the ancient Greek galleries, a particularly fine example by one of the great ancient Greek vase painters, Ezekias. Unfortunately, it's quite broken, but you can still see how effectively the painter conveys what a huge effort this is for Ajax, how strong Ajax has to be with those massive thighs in order to lift the body, and how heavy the dead weight of Achilles' body is, compounded by the added weight of his magnificent helmet, just hanging down limply behind him. That same painter, Ezekias, also painted a different picture of the 2 cousins, here playing a board game during a moment when they are taking a break from combat. And you see there Achilles also wearing a helmet, and you get a sense of the close relationship between the 2 of them. So it's especially poignant to see their relationship transformed from one of shared play between the 2 of them to one of sharp difference between the one of them who is now dead and inert and the other who is exerting himself in this important form of service to his fallen comrade. The story of Ajax has a sad conclusion, which again involves the question of how a dead body will be treated, although no longer on the battlefield. While Ajax and Odysseus are collaborators in rescuing Achilles' body, they soon become rivals when it comes to the question of who will inherit Achilles' armor. There are various stories about how the decision was reached, but in every version, the army's commanders, Agamemnon and Menelaus, award the armor to Odysseus. For Ajax, who was known to be the best warrior after Achilles, this is an unacceptable betrayal. He goes berserk and tries to kill Agamemnon and Menelaus, but is prevented from doing so by divine intervention. This puts him in the truly intolerable position of having failed in what he attempted, but having his hostile intentions revealed, and he sees no other option but to kill himself. The suicide of Ajax was also a popular subject of vase painting. Yeah, and here's a pretty gory version. Ezekias, for whom Ajax was clearly a favorite subject, also produced this more restrained image of the moment just before the suicide, as Ajax plants his sword in the ground in order to jump on it. The story of Ajax's suicide is also dramatized in a play by Sophocles known as Ajax. In that play, the suicide happens about halfway through, and the rest of the action revolves around whether Agamemnon and Menelaus are going to allow his body to be buried, considering what he tried to do to them. The conflict is finally resolved by Odysseus, who argues that the enmity between Ajax and himself and between Ajax and the other Greek leaders should not extend past the moment of Ajax's death and evokes a common human right to burial. So once again, we see what a major theme of Greek literature this question of proper burial was, and proper treatment of dead bodies. And in this play, that pressing question would have been emphasized by the presence of Ajax's dead body lying on the stage while the living characters were wrangling over it. This humiliation was softened by the gesture of Ajax's captive war bride Tecmessa, who covers the body with her cloak. And so I will end with just one more ancient vase painting, one that depicts that moment of care for the body of someone who has died under conditions of violence and conflict. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Bridget. And I'm sure we'll have some questions for you. I know I do. So our next panelist is Tom Matthews. All right. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background, a little bit of bio about Mr. Matthews. Mr. Matthews is a Philadelphia native and received his commission as a second lieutenant in the United States Army through Drexel University, our partner today, and is a graduate of the Command and General Staff College and the United States Army War College. Mr. Matthews also earned a master's degree in business administration from Syracuse. Mr. Matthews, is a master Army aviator who has commanded aviation units at all levels. Of particular note were his commands in the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers, and in the 101st Airborne Division, the Screaming Eagles. Overseas postings include Korea and Honduras, with deployments to the Persian Gulf and Somalia. Mr. Matthews retired as a colonel in 2001 after 28 years of military service. Mr. Matthews began his civilian career on the Joint Staff and was present in the Pentagon on September 11, 2001. Matthews moved to the office of the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security in 2003 and was promoted to the Defense Intelligence Senior Executive Service in 2005. Mr. Matthews coordinates defense intelligence support involving policy, plans, resources, manpower, and reserve intelligence matters with the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, Joint Staff for Intelligence. Please welcome Mr. Matthews.
Morning, everybody. Hey, the first thing I got to do is recognize my wife, Jessie, who is also a graduate, Dr. Jessie, from Drexel University. So I will hear about that if I don't make sure I annotate that. All right, welcome everybody. Thanks for being here. I'm going to go ahead and get into the presentation. I got a narrative and a few slides, and I think it ties in nicely with what you heard in the first presentation. In October of 1993, I was the commander of 1st Battalion, 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, elements of which fought as part of Task Force Ranger in the Battle of Mogadishu in Somalia. On October the 3rd, the soldiers from Task Force Ranger undertook a mission to apprehend several Somali clan leaders responsible for the massacre of 24 Pakistani peacekeepers in June of that year. We successfully completed that mission. We were in the final stages of it when, shortly after that, we successfully completed that mission. Shortly after, the mission changed. This is the point. We had a change of mission at this critical moment. The mission changed to one of securing and recovering the crews of 2 Black Hawks, Super 6-1 and Super 6-4. Both were shot down by heavily armed militia, and what ensued was an 18-hour battle, and it was all about leaving no man behind. After the battle, the media focused on the violence against U.S. soldiers, who many Americans believe were there on a humanitarian mission to end the devastating famine in Somalia. CNN, with its continuous coverage, provided shocking footage of dead American soldiers dragged through the streets by angry Somalis. Struggling to comprehend such acts, some pundits made analogies to Achilles dragging Hector's corpse behind the chariot in the last book of the Iliad. Though our original mission in Mogadishu would be completely foreign to warriors like Achilles and Hector, the warrior ethos that binds soldiers to one another is exactly the same. The 18-hour battle captivated the public. People wrote books, made documentaries, produced a video games about it. The title Mark Bowden's 1999 best-selling book, Black Hawk Down, became shorthand for referring to the mission and its aftermath. Ridley Scott's 2001 film, Black Hawk Down, continues to rank among the top 10 war movies ever produced. You have a map of Somalia here, and I'd like to just talk very briefly about where the battle took place. This is Somalia, a coastal country in the Horn of Africa. Basically, that's the length of the east coast of the United States there is the size of that country. We think of soldiers in combat as fighting for their country. Even Hector claims that soldiers should fight for country. His proclamation invokes the values of patriotism, and Hector was clearly fighting to protect Troy and defeat the Greeks who were trying to take it. American troops, however, were not in Somalia to protect and defend the United States. They were there to enforce UN Resolution 837 to arrest Mohammed Farah Aidid, the clan leader responsible for killing the Pakistani peacekeepers. Though the reason we were there sounds like a police activity, make no mistake about it. This was a combat operation in a very dangerous urban environment. There's a picture of Mogadishu. Task Force Ranger operated from the airfield along the coast. In a Black Hawk, I can fly that city from north to south in about 2 minutes. I can fly the length the other way, east to west, in about 4 minutes. Yet in that space, nearly 2 million Somalis live, and nearly every family owns at least one weapon for protection at a minimum. A well-armed population in an urban environment is a very dangerous situation. I'm going to show a video that depicts the exact moment when our mission changed from capturing clan leaders to leave no man behind.
60 Minutes was able to obtain this surveillance video, which has not been seen publicly until now.
I'm going to point out
Here you can see the very beginning of the mission. Houghton was flown in on one of these Little Bird helicopters to the target building, which was quickly enveloped in clouds of dust. Then, from this rooftop, with his men under fire, Houghton watched as the lead Black Hawk Super 6-1 headed towards him. This is Super 6-1 moments after it was hit by a rocket-propelled grenade, spinning out of control before it's torn apart on impact.
They'd shot down a Black Hawk, this powerful symbol of America's might. For the men on the ground here, it was the moment that changed everything.
The dark figure you can just make out standing on the corner is 25-year-old Staff Sergeant Dan Bush, as he defended Super 6-1 against swarming enemy fighters. He would soon be dead. Norm Houghton says he and his men were doing everything they could to get to the crash site that was in danger of being overwhelmed. In the midst of this intense fight, they faced a nearly impossible task: to free the body of one of the pilots pinned in the wreckage. It took all night.
When the battle was over, the reality of the losses set in. All told, the militia killed 18 American soldiers, wounded 78, and captured CW3 Mike Durant. This is the warrior ethos of the United States Army today. The change of mission now required every soldier to live this. As you can see, the last one is never leave a fallen comrade, but when you put into action that last event, this value immediately incorporates the first three. Recovering the fallen becomes the mission, and soldiers never quit until it's complete. Accepting defeat is not an option. The corollary in Greek literature is strikingly similar. You heard just a few minutes ago more than I can really speak to. The Iliad and the stories about its heroes illustrate the same values. The Greeks and Trojans fight over the body of Patroclus. Achilles refuses to return Hector's corpse to the Trojan and desecrates it, an act even the gods acknowledge is dishonorable. And Ajax risked his life to bring the body of Achilles back for a proper burial. Though millennia separate these acts in ancient Greek literature from today, the ethos is exactly the same: leave no man behind. This recent painting by Sam McIntyre, aptly titled Leave No Comrade Behind, and commissioned for the 30th anniversary of the battle, illustrates how two members of the 160th, Keith Jones and Carl Meyer, have daringly maneuvered their aircraft into a narrow alley near the first Black Hawk crash site to rescue two Delta Force snipers. That was what you saw in that video, and the snipers were the guys moving around. They subsequently both were wounded. One died. You saw those snipers in the video. Carl and Keith landed in that narrow alley while taking fire. I want to emphasize just how narrow that alley was. Their blades were just 2 feet from the alley walls. Imagine landing a helicopter in such a tight space with militia shooting at you from every direction. Landing, however, was not all Keith and Carl did. They fought. As depicted, Carl fired from his seat in the aircraft to provide cover for Keith as he rescued the two wounded snipers. These were two modern warriors exemplifying the ethos of leave no man behind. There is tremendous reassurance to soldiers in combat that their comrades in arms will do whatever it takes to get them back. As with many cultures, retrieving and burying one's dead has profound social implications, even religious ones, and it's cathartic for those involved. Just as the Greeks and Trojans had elaborate funerals for their fallen warriors, the military has its own rituals. Such ceremonies are a form of closure for those who survived and pays tribute to the ultimate sacrifice made by their comrades. In this photo, you can see the customary formation of boots, weapon, and helmet that represent the fallen warriors. When we returned to the airfield after that battle, we had not recovered all our missing warriors. Next is a scene from the film Black Hawk Down. It depicts a seasoned combat veteran and a younger, less experienced soldier, both of whom just survived the 18-hour fight. What you're about to see is an act of mentoring about the warrior ethos.
You going back in?
There's still men out there. God damn. When I go home, people ask me, "Hey, Hoot, why do you do it, man? Why? You some kind of war junkie?" I won't say a goddamn word. Why? They won't understand. They won't understand why we do it. They won't understand it's about the men next to you. And that's it. That's all it is.
The seasoned combat veteran is headed back out to the fight because there are still men out there. The younger, less experienced soldier is incredulous about what they had just been through. He thinks the mission is complete. But this is the teachable moment where the veteran explains that the mission does not end until all warriors are recovered. We eventually recovered all our warriors. Thank you very much.
That was terrific. Thank you so much for that. All right. Our next panelist is Captain Jessica E. Stevenson, who served as an aviation officer and an AH-64D Apache helicopter pilot in the United States Army from 2010 until her retirement as a captain in 2018. Jessica began her military career by attending the United States Military Academy at West Point, from which she graduated in 2010. After graduating from flight school as an Apache longbow pilot, Jessica served in the Task Force Tiger Shark, 110 ATK in the 10th Combat Aviation Brigade, 10th Mountain Allied Division at Fort Drum, New York. She served as a flight and maintenance platoon leader with the TF Tiger Shark in Afghanistan from 2013 to 2014 in support of Operation Enduring Freedom. In addition to flying combat missions, some of our other duties on the deployment included serving as the personnel recovery officer, downed aircraft recovery team officer, and the base defense liaison officer. After her deployment to Afghanistan, Jessica served as the battalion logistics officer, graduated from the aviation captain's career course, and served as the troop commander for the A317 CAV in the 3rd Combat Aviation Brigade, 3rd Infantry Division. Jessica is a combat veteran and deployed to support Operation Enduring Freedom, where she was awarded 3 Air Medals and a Combat Action Badge. She is honored on the Delaware Women's Military Service Monument. Jessica earned her BS in Mechanical Engineering, Mechatronics from the United States Military Academy at West Point, and her MBA from Harvard Business School in 2020. In her free time, Jessica enjoys time with her family, hiking with her dog, traveling, and playing the guitar terribly. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Max. I think you are tasked with one of the hardest things, and that's translating all of our military jargon into sensical words that look really great on paper, but are a little bit harder in the vernacular and how to speak to it. So thank you very much for that wonderful introduction. I just wanted to first highlight how I came to be a part of this organization, and it was really by chance. There was an opportunity for a book club to connect with other veterans in the area, and I thought, I'm bored. I'd like to meet other veterans, so why not? And it's really been a wonderful experience. We've read the Iliad, we've read the Odyssey, and we're working on lots of different projects here. Most recently, the Veteran History Exchange, and Max and her Wiley Carusi Mark here today have really done a great job bringing together the veteran community of Greater Philadelphia and helping us connect not only with each other but with other members of the community. And for that, I'm very grateful. It's a lot of work, and we're not the easiest people to wrangle together most of the time. So thank you so much. So I often try and humanize who I am and my experiences. I used to go to job interviews and people would say, wow, I don't know if you know this, but your resume is really intimidating. I was like, I don't know. There's lots of people who go out and do what I do, because the military is full of ordinary people who sign up to go on an extraordinary journey, and they do it together. Nothing that I accomplished in my military career was due to my own actions other than hard work, showing up on time in the right uniform, and doing my very best. And we make that commitment to each other to be there and to go through our training so we are prepared for the worst. So what's an Apache longbow, and what's the view from up there? And we'll get to the view, but first I just wanted to show what an amazing piece of technology the Apache longbow is. I used to be kind of chided when I was at West Point, oh, women can't go infantry. That's since changed. But I used to joke, do you know what the Apache longbow brings to the battlefield? It's a lot more than one infantry soldier. And I was very proud to bring that technology to the battlefield in defense of our ground forces. So a little bit there, we've got Hellfire missiles, rockets, 30 millimeters, machine gun. It's really an amazing piece of technology. We have sensors that can see at night, that can see in the day, that can see through dust, and it gives a wonderful picture of what's going on the ground. I try and refrain from always saying battlefield because we get used in creative ways. Sometimes we go out to do reconnaissance and secure a route. Sometimes we go out because people need our help, and sometimes we go out because we have an operation to get a named individual or to strike a target. So it's a really multifaceted platform that we use in support of American forces and also our coalition forces. On the bottom of the screen, that's the typical, every pilot has this photo. It's fully kitted out. You're ready to go out on your mission, and you're super proud of everything you've done. That photo for me was taken in May of 2013. It was my first combat flight. It was a trying flight, but as you can see, it was about 7 years in the making between the 4 years at West Point, the 2 years in flight school, and the year train up to get there. And for me, that was my crowning achievement in my service to my country. And I'm from Delaware, so there's nothing like a little bit of state pride to fly the flag and let everybody know that this small state packs a mighty punch. And then, all this, like I said in job interviews, oh, it's a very intimidating resume. I'm just a normal person. Happy birthday, Mom. I was out on a mission and I wanted my mom to know I was thinking about her, and she's here today. Hi, Mom. Everybody out on these missions, everybody that signs up to the military has a mom and a dad waiting for them back home, has brothers and sisters, has a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a wife or husband, and children. And we've heard about leave no comrade behind. It comes from a deep place. Each and every one of us want to come back desperately, and we're there to make sure that we come back together, because everybody has somebody waiting for them back home. Everybody has someone who loves them. So we train for the worst case scenario. And we heard a little bit earlier about the warrior ethos, about some of the missions that we've had. And what I'd like to highlight first and foremost is that the military is a learning organization, not just from recent actions, not just in our lifetime, but through the entire course of humanity. Military leaders and scholars like to anchor back to antiquity and say, this is where this drive comes from. But at the end of the day, it's a very human experience that the military attempts to codify in a set of procedures, in a set of rules, in a set of parameters so that we can be successful. So there are a couple organizations out there that I'd like to highlight that do this kind of work specifically. The first is the Joint Personnel Recovery Agency. Now, they were formally established in their current state in 1999, but this organization focuses on helping individuals be reconstituted with their unit. This goes back as long as there's been a military. The focus is to get back to your unit, whether you're alive or if it's a body recovery. They are a learning organization. They capture lessons learned, they codify manuals, they update procedures, they keep up-to-date technology so that no matter who goes out on the battlefield, we guarantee that they'll come back to us. The second is the Defense POW and MIA Accounting Agency, and they were formally codified in 2015, but they have many, many predecessors that officially go back all the way to World War II. And these two organizations are responsible for the prevention of isolation as well as the return if there are missing remains. As of May 2023, the Defense POW and MIA Accounting Agency lists 81,000 American soldiers unaccounted for in all of her conflicts. Afghanistan has a unique designation as being the first major American conflict to result in 0 unaccounted for individuals. And when I show you some of the pictures of the terrain, I think that that just speaks to the training we've had, the ethos we have, the love for each other we have, and just how committed America is to returning its sons and daughters back to her homeland. Okay, so a little bit about the photos. I like to leave the photos up while I speak because there's a lot to take in. The first one to the left is a training mission. So I served as the downed aircraft recovery team officer in charge. And what that meant is that I was responsible for our maintenance team's recovery assets to go out and specifically bring a helicopter back. But we also had a secondary mission. So as the personnel recovery officer, if the pilots, if the crew, if the passengers, in the case of a Black Hawk or Chinook, were unable to be evacuated and their remains stayed behind, we would also be responsible for that mission. The American military does not like to do things alone. So when we're out there training, we have overhead aviation support, we have vehicles on the ground, we have a large, whatever the contingency has requested of us, we bring that to bear. So we're not out there alone, and we're helping bring the people that were involved in the incident back as well as each other. The picture to my left, your right, of the medevac, that's a real photo that I got from a news article. It's what we think about when we're training for the worst case scenario. And in Afghanistan, the improvised explosive devices and the kind of destruction that they bear is visible on this military vehicle. There's a picture of it in the center lower. That's what it once looked like. So the people inside needed help desperately. The people who are actions on, the soldiers in the photo below. As the medevac, which is medical evacuation helicopter, approaches, the soldiers protect the wounded, protect the injured with their own bodies from any debris that might fly around. This happens during fire. This happens during the break where a medevac would come out. And you can see everybody is shielding somebody. We care very deeply for our wounded. And that's the kind of scenario that my soldiers and I were preparing for on a regular basis and the kinds of missions that I was out on. In the bottom left, you'll see we bring very cool tools, hacksaws, jaws of life style equipment. This is a lot of training that goes into these. It's not just a mission where it's like, hey, why don't we grab 3 people and go out and get this aircraft? We do extensive amounts of training. The photo below on the right side of your slide is an example of that's a real situation, as well as the one above for the kind of terrain that we could find ourselves in. And I don't know if you noticed, but the photos on the left side of the screen from Fort Drum look very different. Yes, there's vegetation, but very flat. So the soldiers have to adapt and overcome to any situation that they deal with. I like these pictures because they highlight the full breadth of the kind of terrain that we found ourselves in Operation Enduring Freedom. They're very inhospitable, excuse me. Some of them are beyond what we would call the forward line of troops. We're out there alone on the mission. There could be as few as 4 Americans in these valleys and nobody for hours. On the right side of the screen, this is actually looking towards China. It's way, way, way off in the distance, but that's kind of the scale of the valleys that we would find ourselves in. When we went out on these missions, we did pre-mission briefs and we talked about what if we have an emergency? What if we crash land? What if we get shot down? What will we do? And on the missions, for all the photos that you see, we were so far away from our Air Force counterparts who have the pararescue jumpers that would come and get us, that we knew that we were the only 4 people that would have a say in what happened to us. It sounds a little scary to say out loud, but at the time I was very confident that that was all that I needed, myself and the 3 others who were highly trained in what we did. I actually had a hydraulics failure that nearly forced us to the ground in an area that looked not too different from the bottom left-hand side of the screen. And we were so confident that we were going to crash land that we briefed and went through the entire discussion. If you crash, what will I do? What will the backseater do? What will the front seater do? In the Apache, there's two, and they sit one in front of the other. What will the other aircraft do, and how will we get through this? And we immediately made radio calls back to our main station and told them, we think we're going to have an emergency. Get ready. We heard the call come back. Oh no, Lieutenant Stevenson's out on the mission and her DART team isn't there with her. You're not supposed to say names on the radio like that. That's not great form. But I knew that that was their manifestation of their care and concern for not only myself as the OIC of the DART team, but every single member of the task force. How are we going to get out there and support them? How will we make sure that they come back in one piece? And I think about that warrior ethos, how much that weighs on people, especially when you are in the unit and you know them. It's different than for me when I went out on missions for organizations that I did not know. Before we move on to the next slide, something I want to bring into perspective that both Colonel Matthews and I served in a time with an all-volunteer military. The individuals that are drawn to an all-volunteer military, I think, are a little bit different on average as far as commitment to the mission set that we may have than perhaps a drafted military. My father served beginning in 1980, and he used to talk about stories from his older soldiers who had served in Vietnam, where there was a commitment for sure to retrieve remains, but perhaps not on that same mission, perhaps not in that same day, perhaps not in that same month, that eventually that this would occur, but not with as much urgency as I felt and I was trained with. And I think that it's really important to highlight that as the military has evolved in time, like I said, that we're a learning organization, there are some basic humanitarian links that join all of us together throughout the spread of time. And that is, we wish to recover the remains, we wish to save those to our left and right, and we wish to do it to the best of our abilities. I bring all that up because these are cultural norms for us. And for whatever reason, you know, that's way beyond my expertise. We have evolved this way. We have codified them between the Defense POW and MIA Accounting Agency and the Joint Personnel Recovery Agency. We have written these down that these are the procedures we will always follow. But we do not have a universally accepted procedure when we come to partnered missions. So without further ado, so when we go out on missions, America right now in the world is not acting unilaterally. She's partnered with people. I was in a NATO mission for ISAF, International Security Assistance Forces. That means that I could be out on a mission supporting British soldiers on the ground, the Afghan National Police at a checkpoint, then perhaps Polish Special Forces that evening. I could cover a lot of ground really quickly and find myself working with different organizations. Our NATO forces tend to align with the American military. We valued injured soldiers being removed from the battlefield as quickly as possible. And when we came to partnered operations with the Afghan National Army, the Afghan National Air Force, the Afghan National Police, we found that due to religious reasons, we had different procedures that we wanted to prioritize. So because of Islamic burial requirements, the Afghan National Army wanted to prioritize their killed or deceased soldiers. In the American military, we do not send medevac out there unless someone has a pulse, unless we think that we can save them. And we are extremely efficient at that. We have a 1 hour golden window where we want to get people to the care they need. So to be out on a partnered mission and hear an interpreter request for a medevac for a dead Afghan National Army soldier, it threw a bit of a wrench in our operations. It was at a time in 2013 when we were working on standing up the Afghan National Army so that they could have the full complement of military skill sets to include air assault or reconnaissance and medevac, the medical evacuation. And something we hadn't quite worked through in this transition was, well, if we're on a partnered mission, how do we prioritize? In the American military, we would consider the recovery of remains a hero mission, and we honor them, and there are certain procedures that go in line with this to make sure that we're using our assets, as we would say, properly, but I would argue that it's in alignment with our values and in alignment with our procedures that we've codified for ourselves. The Afghan National Army felt very differently about these procedures, and it made it caused a bit of a fight on the radio when we were trying to relay our higher leaders' orders to what was going to happen. And eventually, for the missions that I was on, we did come to an established procedure of how to make sure that we honored the burial requirements of our partnered soldiers, and also maintained America's priorities to not put people at an elevated level of risk for a deceased soldier. Because for Americans, risking lives for wounded soldiers, for soldiers whose duty status is unknown, absolutely full-throated support for that. But to risk a life for someone who's already deceased was not how our procedures were set up, especially in 2013 in the very rugged regions of Afghanistan. As I showed you in some of the earlier pictures, help could be 2 to 3 hours away. And perhaps in those 2 to 3 hours, an active mission would need that support sooner. So these are the sorts of things that we had to balance. I'm very proud to report that in my time in Afghanistan, the Afghan National Air Force did a phenomenal job of standing up their own medevac procedures. And what you can see from some of these pictures is the skill and the expertise that the Afghan National Army brought to the table. I will say, watching some of the missions that these individuals went on, fantastic pilots, absolutely wonderful execution of their duties. And most importantly, America stood with her partnered forces by taking care of their priorities, their dead and their wounded, in the priority that they wanted. I think the last thing that I would like to say is, and this is from a discussion with Colonel Matthews a little bit earlier, on average, we're talking about individuals between the ages of 19 and 25 who are out here on the battlefield trying to execute these. And in Afghanistan in particular, we saw individuals in the Afghan National Army and Afghan National Police is, perhaps as young as 16, because age is a little less codified there, a little less set in stone, all the way to 50. And watching the effort that they put in to go and retrieve their deceased soldiers so that they could be given the proper burial rights, their commitment was equal to ours in how we approached retrieving our dead. We had this universal bridge in common, that we had to honor those who gave their lives in defense of our mission and in defense of each other. And it takes a lot of courage to run out into a battle to try and save someone. And these gentlemen who we saw on the battlefield, they did it in spades. So at that, I will conclude my portion. Thank you so much.
All right. We're going to move on to our Q&A portion of our program, because we're hoping that those of you who are in our audience and who have joined us online, that you might have a question or two for our panelists. And so our panelists are going to take a seat here, and then they each have a microphone and they're able to respond directly to any questions. So if you look here, there's Ralph is running around with the microphone. So could you advance it, Dugan? Ralph is running around with the microphone. So we ask those who are here with us to, raise their hand and all. Yeah, to raise your hand, and Ralph will come and find you. And then if you are with us over Zoom, if you could put your question in our in the Q&A thing. So here's a question right here.
Hi, my name is Jesse Hamilton. I'm a PhD student here at Penn in philosophy. I'm also a U.S. Army veteran, Iraq War veteran, and just wanted to thank my fellow brothers and sisters in aviation for providing all of the support that you did when I was in country. So I was on a MIT team, and I was an advisor to to the Iraqi Army in Fallujah, and we would oftentimes find ourselves out on a patrol, and we were the only American there, or maybe we were one of 2 Americans there, and we wore these like GPS finders, and we knew that we had bounties, or our best intelligence told us that we had bounties on us, and that AQIZ, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, was planning on kidnapping or attempting to kidnap or like to kidnap one of us. And so I never had to use that device, thankfully. Neither did anyone I know. But just having the device and knowing that being kidnapped was a possibility was always top of mind. And at night, I would think about, like what would happen if I was kidnapped or if I was kidnapped and killed. And I found myself not wanting my fellow American soldiers and Iraqi counterparts to take on any risk to recover my body. And so that was my personal view. But as Jess, you were talking, you said, you reminded me that I'm someone's son and I'm someone's friend, and that it might be really important if I'm deceased on the battlefield to my family and my friends, for my body to be recovered by someone. And so I just wanted to get the panelists' thoughts on when we say we're going to leave no one behind. Are we doing it for the person themselves? I know, having read some ancient Greek philosophy, that there were various different conceptions of how a life worth well lived included things that happened after one died. But I never thought about the family part of that. And like, I would just love to hear your thoughts on what role others play in our mantra to leave no one behind. So, thank you.
I guess if one of you wanted to start off with an observation about that, that would be great.
Okay, I guess even though you used me in the example, I guess I'll go first. I think what matters to families is a strong driver for individuals, because like you, Jesse, I told my brother, hey, if anything happens to me while I'm in Afghanistan on this deployment, get out of the army. Because I told him, I was like, listen, the guy that killed me, he's dead 30 seconds after he did it. So get out. Mom and dad don't need to lose too. I was like, there is no avenging me. So I think there's a highly individual perspective to it. But I was also very aware of the gap that it leaves when there is no body to be buried. I go and visit my grandfather. His grave, he served in the Korean conflict. And there is a headstone nearby that I noticed a couple weeks ago, and nobody had been there. And I went over to it and I took the grass off of it. And I realized that this was an in memoriam placard for a gentleman who was never recovered from the Korean War. And I saw next to that, when I took the grass away, that there were lots of flowers, fake flowers that had fallen down inside the grass. So I think for us, it matters culturally how we're brought up. So the culture that we are currently in values the recovery of the bodies to bring them back. And I think that brings a level of closure for people that's really profound. Like I agree with you. For me, I don't want anyone else getting put at risk. But I know when I was out on those missions, I felt a strong requirement to go and recover bodies for the families, right? And I think that's because my love of my parents, my want for people to have closure in the community. But I think when I highlight the differences between us and the Afghanis, they're driven by a similar thing. They want to recover the bodies so they can have the proper Islamic burial rites performed in a timely manner. So I guess what I would say is, I feel like it's individual, but I feel like as a collective, somehow we've come to this agreement that that there's an imperative. And even if it takes 40 or 50 years, they're still recovering bodies from the Korean War, from World War II, and from World War I. And the DPAA still runs genetic testing on unknown soldiers from the American Civil War and before. So I know that doesn't give you a great answer, but I think it's not really up to the individual at that point. I think it's up to the community to decide its priorities.
I mean, yeah, I can certainly think of some instances in ancient Greek literature where you can see that it matters terribly to a family member for a body to be properly treated. And you think of like Sophocles' Antigone, where this young woman who doesn't have to really puts her own life at risk to just make sure that her brother gets the proper burial rites. And I think in the ancient world, the deprivation of burial is so tied up with dishonor, that dishonor is felt very, very strongly by family members. And I'm also just thinking about your experience, thinking about some moments when someone in advance expresses a strong desire that their body will be treated properly. And so I'm thinking of the moment in the Iliad when Hector and Achilles first or sort of encounter each other before their final battle. And Hector says, look, let's make a deal. Whoever of us kills the other, and they know that that's going to happen, will allow the other's body to be taken back and treated properly. And at that point, you really see that there's just a different degree of intensity and ferocity between Achilles and Hector, because Hector says, no, I'm not going to make any deal with you. And, you know, lions don't make deals with human beings. It's as if we're a different species. So I think you see that, but there to Hector, that's really, and I think he's thinking about what this will mean to his family. That's really important in advance.
So you don't get a vote at that time. Okay, and it's a tugging and a pulling. Once you're dead, I get it, and you don't want any of your buddies risking their lives, them ending up dead, second, third order effect to their families and their unit. But it's way bigger than any individual. It is the ethos, it's the organization, it's what we're committed to doing. You may be dead, but we're going to come get you. All right. And your family will appreciate that.
All right, next question.
Thank you all for a wonderful presentation. My name's Joe Eastman. I'm a retired Navy LDO, officer enlisted man, Vietnam, Desert Storm. And I kind of want to piggyback on what Jesse said. There's somebody that I know whose older brother was in the Air Force. I didn't know him because he was about 5 years older than I was. He graduated from the Air Force Academy. Was out on a mission, they believe over water. He was a pilot. And they lost contact with him. They never recovered even a bolt from the plane, obviously no bodies. And as I got older and I thought about Major Ron Bond, who has been redesignated as KIA, it's been almost 50 years. His parents were very active in trying to find out what happened to his son. But as I was talking to his sister one day, who I knew, it occurred to me, and this is what drives the going out and trying to recover bodies home to me, is that his parents went to their grave never knowing the status of their son. And I always thought that was very powerful, that probably their last moment was thinking about him and never knowing if he was alive or dead. From what I understand, they believe he died because they couldn't recover, and they still haven't recovered anything. They believe he went down over water, but they never knew. But every time I talk to Ron's sister, I think about his parents, that they just never, ever knew the status of their son. Thank you.
If I may.
Yeah, please.
And Joe, I'd tell you that the DPAA, they're not giving up on that. He's counted among those 81,000. And one day somebody may recover a piece of the plane, you know, it may wash up, and no one's going to stop until they've accounted for each and every one of them. And that's the really cool thing about the codification of the ethos that we have in the DPAA. So hopefully in time for his sister.
And if I could relate it to the museum a little bit, part of the team that is taking on, that does this work, there are a number of anthropologists, archaeologists who are a part of that team, and they do their forensic work, and so it's a multidisciplinary effort in order to try to get this information, to do the research, to, if necessary, do an excavation, you name it, in order to identify and return remains to their loved ones. So it can be efforts that take years, in fact. But yeah, that work is ongoing. I know a great deal about that. So I have a question from a person who's joined us online. Matt Blair asks, so Matt, an undergraduate nursing student, an Army veteran from the 82nd Airborne Division. For any panelists, very few events change our core values, but also very few people experience the intimacy of personal combat. Did anything about your experience in combat, especially the altruism of fighting for the person beside you, fundamentally change?
Well, first of all, airborne, being 82nd, he was a paratrooper. I don't think anything fundamentally changes, all right? Situations change, but it's the ethos. The ethos is not specific to any fight, any particular area of the world. It is the ethos that is instilled in every soldier when they come in. And most people don't think about it. I mean, it's one of those things, and you never, most of the time, you don't think you're going to die anyway. You know, you always think of in terms, because that's tough to inculcate to yourself too, thinking, oh, I'm going to die here. You never think you're going to die. All right. You know, there may be casualties, but you don't normally project that on yourself. So again, there's this distance from the situation where you think you will be able to help, you will be able to make a difference, but you never look at yourself and think that'll be me. But I would tell you, if one were to pause and reflect on it, they know the behavior that will be exhibited, though, if that were the case.
Mm-hmm.
Sorry about that. The only thing I'd like to add to that, sir, is I think for me, going to combat did change my perspective a little bit. Perhaps it was because of my age at the time and how young I was in my training, and then how soon I entered into combat relative to maybe experiences of other generations of military members. I think for me, I knew it was always a possibility, but exactly like you said, it wasn't going to be me because I was an Apache helicopter pilot. Is going to make a difference, right? I think everybody who signs up for a thing that they believe their job will make a difference. It won't be them. They'll be in the efforts to recover it. But my first combat mission that we took a loss of a coalition soldier made it real in a way that I don't think the training could capture. I won't say it didn't prepare me for it, because it did, but if you allowed yourself to take a breath and to feel the emotions of it, it was palpably different than how it went in training. Because, you know, at the end of the day, the training, it's going to index, the casualty's fine. Sure, you've now had to write a letter home to go through it and try and face the emotion. But the first day that I made it back on a mission to go to a ramp side service, when they brought a body in a body bag down the walkway, I remember just absolutely crying and having to turn away from the ramp so that my soldiers couldn't see me cry. And when I turned away, what I saw was every soldier behind me crying. So we want to be tough and we want to be hard, but the humanity deep down inside of us just won't allow that completely to be cut out.
Thank you for sharing that. Thank you so much for explaining that to us. So, is there another question? Because until we get another question, then I'm going to step in with a question. Can you tell us a little bit about what you've learned about battlefields, like each of you, like when it comes to approaching it, you know, for you, Bridget, in literature, but I think working with veterans, hearing these stories, and again, participating in live action changes how you approach a battlefield. So could you talk to us a little bit about that?
So I guess I think one thing that I think that the Iliad portrays really well, which people who've been in actual combat, as I haven't, will certainly, I think, confirm, is how confusing it is. I mean, I think the Iliad, where the poet, I mean, has an exact understanding of what's going on and what story he wants to tell, yet he also is really effective at just giving you a sense of how you only know what's going on in your little corner of the battlefield and you really can't see the whole picture. So I think that's one thing that I've learned. The other thing, I think that reading these texts and talking to people like my co-panelists has just constantly reinforced for me is that message that was there in the film clip we saw about it's about the guy next to you. How in these myths about, you know, a war that's fought for an ostensible cause, that becomes totally immaterial when somebody's comrade dies. And that's what really keeps these wars going in these texts. So those are, I think, the two, just what a powerful source of motivation it is and how it really obliterates all other concerns. So those are, I think, the two things that I've really learned from my non-immediate experience.
From your civilian perspective,
experience.
right? Mhm. Jess or Tom, would you like to add to that?
I think what the perspective of history has given me is how I've said it. This is kind of like my theme today, how universal these themes are for humanity. In all the different cultures, there is some emphasis placed on the recovery of remains of taking care of your people to your left and right. And again, I think because of my age and the time in which I served, you think, oh, the attack on the American the trade centers, towers this was unprecedented, right? But we can look back at Pearl Harbor, we can look back at all sorts of different impetuses that have caused conflict over the years. And the more that I've learned about history, the more that I see what we all have in common, and that is life is extremely fragile and we wage war for very specific reasons. And life is so sacred, but we're willing to risk it when we go to war for whatever reason. And for me, that's changed how I read history, how I interpreted casualty lists. When you hear, oh, there's a battle and so many people are killed. When you're a kid, you write it down so you can pass the test. You're like, okay, 1,000 people dead in this battle. Casualties were so significant, the military couldn't carry on. And now when I read it, I think 1,000 people in one battle. And I think about exponentially the number of family members and relatives that are left behind and the hole that puts in the town that the regiment was formed from or the country where they came from. And so for me, it has made history a little bit more somber as I go back and read it now that I have that experience.
Slightly different response on it from the perspective. So we were talking prior to the panel about and people wonder, how will I behave in a real situation like that? What will I do? There's concern that you will fail your comrade. It's always, what will I do? And so you have that thought in your head, and you say, how will I act? Well, this goes back to a conversation we had before the panel, and that is, you'll react exactly the way you're trained, because at the time of that crisis, you have no time to think. You only react. So in training, prior to any real world combat operation, the amount of time that leaders put into rehearsing contingencies is really, really important. And you run through combinations, permutations of your immediate action drills and responses. Everyone wants to immediately respond. If you let everyone immediately respond, it's chaos. The fight's probably chaos to begin with. You don't need to add to it. So how you behave is actually trained ahead of time. And the sequencing and the behavior is for a very specific purpose at the time of these similar events. And then, so training is of paramount importance before you ever deploy, or even when you are deployed, practicing the worst case scenarios, because when it pops up, you have no time to think, you have no time to talk about it, you have no time to whiteboard it, you just have to react. And then the control of that chaos from a command and control perspective is something you try to manage, given how people are going to react and how they're prepared and trained to react. And so the training ahead of time is really, really important.
Thank you. We did talk a little bit about some of these aspects before the discussion began today. So I appreciate you, reframing that in this context, because we were talking a little bit more about leadership and what kind of leadership do you need in a crisis? And I think Tom was explaining to us how the training can kick in, and then the contingencies that you hopefully will have trained for, and then your reactions should be based upon that training. But if I recall correctly, one of the other things you said, Tom, and I'd like you to elaborate on this, was that everyone wants to help, and that finding ways to channel that desire to help and be involved and do stuff to solve this particular problem is a real issue.
Right, so each individual sees or senses what happened and they want to help. Everybody wants to help. But if you let everybody try to help at once independently, it's, as I mentioned, it's chaos. So you almost have to hold the reins back on, and I had to do that in Mogadishu in a couple of cases. I had guys wanting to fly into places that the dust hadn't even settled. Take a breath, stand by, let the dust settle here. What do we got? Let's assess it and let's see what the maybe better course of action might be. But it's like, it's like a team of horses. You had to hold them back because there wasn't one guy there that wasn't looking to move to the sound of the guns or to the problem and try to help.
Jessica, I see you smiling. You want to add to that?
I was at a much more junior level on my deployment than Colonel Matthews was. So I was definitely one of those people that needed to be held back, but I was also in a leadership position. And so I had a responsibility to at the same time try and direct and hold back. And I can think of more than one occasion taking initiative anyway and getting a little bit of a talking to, but not so sternly that it was detrimental, because things are fluid on the battlefield and we have procedures and we have goals, but we also empower junior level leaders to make decisions. So sometimes you have to hold back, and sometimes you have to trust that the American soldier in particular is going to execute with the right initiative to get the job done, that sometimes it happens so quickly we wouldn't have been able to radio it back up to Colonel Matthews in time for him to tell us if we could do it or not. So I'm just smiling because it's all a little bit of give and take, and you try and make sure that you're doing the right thing as you've been instructed from senior level leadership.
Another thought that occurred to me is, and even in the worst situations in cases, there's lessons to be learned for the next time that you might be able to improve upon. In the case of what you saw there, that video in that urban environment and the confusion, the dust, the dynamics of an urban fight is the dirtiest possible fight you can be in. And the reason it is because you have no distance. If you're in an Apache and you can stand off 5 kilometers, lock onto a target and engage it from a distance, that's in combat terms a luxury. But if you're in an urban combat environment and you're in a fight, it's a direct firefight. You got a gun, I got a gun. You shoot at me, I shoot at you. You hit me first, you win. The additional advantage we had is we had helmets and we had some Kevlar. And in the case of the aircraft, we could move. But on the street in an urban environment, it's a brawl. And you don't even have to expose yourself. You can put a weapon around a corner, put it on full automatic and move it. And everything is a direct firefight. What we learned, several of the lessons learned afterwards, which were then inculcated to training and education for the future, is in an urban fight, in the case we had, what did people need the most? They consolidated around that first crash site. 99 guys spent the night around that crash site until we could get the rescue column out. They were fighting for their lives every minute. We ran a resupply into the perimeter with one of my Blackhawks after dark because they needed IV, they needed water, and they needed ammunition. It was packed in bulk back at the airfield. We didn't have it broken down in small enough deliverable packages for the situation that we had. That took some adaptation. Everybody, every American in that fight did something to help what was going on forward in the city. Whether it was refueling, rearming the aircraft, whether it was breaking down the supplies and packaging them for an aerial delivery to the inside that perimeter. And I had to bring, so 2 helicopters were shot down. That is the focus of the movie. I actually had 5 helicopters shot down. The other 3 made it back to the coast, 1 to the port, 2 made it back to the airfield. Never to fly again though, and none of those guys were killed. But repackaging of the IV, the medicine, the water, and the food was critical. Flying that bird now in, I just called my next pilot. I said, pick up that resupply and bring it to the perimeter. All he said was, Roger, out. He picked it up and they flew in and came to a hover in the middle of that city at night, right over the perimeter where the guys were inside buildings to deliver that resupply. He got the hell shot out of him. He probably had 40 bullet holes in the aircraft when he made it back to the airfield. Fortunately, they didn't shoot the aircraft down, but that aircraft was out of the fight. But there was not one hesitation. 2 words, Roger, out. That's all he said.
Wow, what a story. I'm often amazed at the stories that our veterans tell. There are a few words to describe, like the drama, the intensity, the emotion, but also the courage and the risk. And that you share these stories so freely. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. We really, really appreciate it. So Bridget, I have a question for you, and then I'll return to our 2 veterans after I ask this question of you. So you have visited Troy, right? And you've also talked with our veterans about this issue of the body and how important the body is. And we've been hearing about rescuing the body and how vital that is, and the lengths that comrades will go to pull it off. But I just wanted to ask you, like, if on an emotional level, those experiences that you've had vis-a-vis Troy, vis-a-vis talking about this literature, has that affected you emotionally? Have you changed a little bit?
Certainly, I think, I think, I mean, you know, it can be abstract and it can be a little distant, when you're reading, when you're reading Homer, when you're doing all the things that you do when you read Homer, like struggling to figure out exactly what the Greek is saying. And there's an artistic design there and so forth. And I just think, I think both of the experiences that you're talking about, going to the actual site where the battle took place or where the war took place, and also simply talking to people who've had that experience really does change things. I'll talk about another experience, which is a little peripheral to what we're talking about, but I think had an enormous impact on me, which is that, so I've been to Troy twice now with a graduate seminar taught with my colleague here in the museum, Brian Rose, where we take a group of students to Troy. One of the things that we've done both times is we have also had a playwright with us who led us in a staged reading of Euripides' Trojan Women, which is a play about the experience of the women who are about to be deported from Troy when it's fallen. And we've had the experience of reading that poem in a theater at Troy. And that was the kind of, that was the kind of on the ground, the grounding in the actual site that made that play, which, I mean, it's always can seem a little abstract if you're reading it on the page, but performing it there made just that experience a different one of the women who are left behind and then off being dispersed to a very uncertain future. That made that very real for me.
And who are also doing the burial as well, right?
That's
of these
right.
fallen warriors, right?
Yeah, that's one of the things that happens in that. Yeah.
So we have a question in the back.
Hi, and this question is for Captain Stevenson. Ever since reading Bob Mason's Chicken Hawk, helicopters, I think, are like the coolest things ever. So thank you for that. But you clearly, when you were talking, you were there was a sense of how much you wanted to protect the troops on the ground. And you're obviously, being a helicopter pilot, very intense situations. So as you transitioned into civilian life, how did your time, in service and being in those intense situations, like how did you navigate going to a less anxiety prone type of career? Was that a difficult transition for you?
I know what I'm supposed to, sorry, I keep talking before the mic kicks on. I know what I'm supposed to say. I know what the narrative is, and I'll just say, I think it's really different for everybody. I took some really strong lessons learned from my time in service. And after my deployment to Afghanistan, it really put what is an emergency in perspective. And so I had a reputation for, there were a lot of officers around me who were very intense and every little thing was important. And I'd be like, yeah, some of it's important, some of it's for training, and that's important. And some of it's just, we don't need to get upset about it. So I established a reputation as I wasn't going to yell at anybody unless like life, limb, or eyesight came into play, because whatever it was going to be recoverable and things just weren't that bad. And so that's something that I really try and bring into my civilian life. I will tell you, things are less intense. Things to me are a little boring. The desk is really not that cool. I had a desk in the Army, and I didn't spend very much time at it. Now that my life involves desk and exclusively desk and not also pilot time, it is much slower. And I really take the lessons of take care of your people to heart. I think that's been the biggest value add that I as a veteran have brought to the workplace. I had a job for about a year where I was taking care of people who we might consider like a frontline worker in America with direct access to clients. And I always took their requirements into consideration as my number one priority. Not whatever the slide widget needed, not whatever, the new hot, totally abstract project was that maybe was going to come into effect in 3 weeks, 3 months, whatever it was. I would be appropriate. I would do it, but I would talk to my direct reports and say, what do you need? What do you need to be successful today? Because in the military, we know officers are just there to coordinate resources and make big decisions. But as you go down in the military organization in the hierarchy, that people who are doing the job, the soldiers who are on the front line, they are critical to mission success. And you have to have the right training, and you have to have the right people, and you have to have it resourced correctly. And that emphasis on making sure that the doer of the deed that's going to make you money in the civilian world is so critical and so important. I think that's my strong differentiator. Also, I try not to let molehills mess up my day. I try not to get caught up in this is very important because it's always been important. I'm like, but is it? And sometimes that's not appreciated, but I don't want to be dramatic. Like, been in combat, some things about me I really like and I'm not going to change, and that's one of them. So I think for everybody in their military experiences, it differs. It also differs on what industry you go into. It differs on what firm you work with. But at the end of the day, taking care of people, I believe, is my number one learning point from the military, and I think is the most appreciated thing that I bring into the civilian world.
The joke always was if you had to leave a flying assignment, you got to fly a desk. So it sounds like that's where you're at.
Well, I think, Colonel, you would be really familiar with that too. You made the tradition to more of a desk job as well. So I imagine that was quite a change. There are other questions. Ralph, do you see? So we'll take this gentleman here and then you, Mark, okay? I mean, this woman here, excuse me.
Hi, I'm Jessie Matthews, Tom's wife. So this question is for Professor Monahan and for Jessica. So
He talks to me all the time.
There's been some reference here to the role of women. So Jessica, you talked about combat fields being open to women recently. And there is a new translation of the Iliad coming out, but there's a lot of discussion because it has a female translator. So in the scope of your experiences, especially with a work like the Iliad, which is, it's not that there's no women in it, but the battles are fought by men. Do you see any sort of gendered perspective in this entire sort of honoring the dead, make sure that no one gets left behind? Where is the role of women, and how did that change for you, Jessica, when you were actually in the battle?
What a great question.
That was deep, deep. I guess I'll start with the easier thing. How did that change when I was in battle? And I very strongly believe that the military, even though there's friction whenever we're integrating any job, whether it's by gender or historically by race, at the end of the day, when the bullets fly, nobody really cares and everyone is looking out for each other. There are studies in units that have fallen apart and couldn't overcome their differences, but by and large, as soon as we stepped out onto the battlefield, it didn't matter, and none of it mattered. And I was a valued member of the team, and not to toot my own horn, but at times was the differentiator between, failure and success. And each member of the team has the opportunity to do that as well, as long as their training has been to the right standard. We go out on the battlefield and we treat everybody like an equal. I think there was some novelty involved with me being out on the battlefield. I had some very unsettling experiences by being recognized in the dining facility based on my voice, because the infantry soldiers on the ground would talk to me on the radio. And even if they weren't the one talking to me, often the radio was on a headset and also on a speaker. So people in the vehicle could hear. And some of my warrant officers did have to intervene one time, because a very well-meaning young man would not leave me alone. He was like, "Are you gun 26?" And I was like, I am known by that on some occasions, like, how may I help you? And he wanted to tell me that we made him feel better that day, and he couldn't differentiate the male voices that he heard on the radio. But because there were so few women, when he heard a woman talking in the dining facility, he immediately recognized me as the one who'd been on his mission. And I thought that was really powerful, and it was a great example of my gender allowed for that connection, because otherwise it would have been missed. And these were individuals that we had never met before. And on that day, my team was responsible for that organization, for that platoon, to get out and to take no casualties. So that was really impactful. He did end up having to be like gently led away, like, okay, that's great. Okay, ma'am, you're good. We got him out of here. I was like, thank you. Because, as a woman in a combat zone, sometimes you don't necessarily want that recognition, right? And so as a woman out on the battlefield, we used to be briefed, hey, the number one target, as we learned from Black Hawk Down, and everyone has seen that movie, was getting an American aviator was high value. It showed success of your organization. If you could take down an American helicopter, the most advanced piece of technology on the battlefield, you were a real winner. And if you could get their pilots, you had some prestige assigned to you. And the danger in that, in being an American helicopter pilot and a woman, being in the far extremes and beyond the flot and away from friendly forces, is I knew the risks that I was taking on. And I think in some ways, that emboldened, I'll speak for myself, like, to be extremely good at my job. And when I was out there, to guarantee success for myself and others. The last thing that I'll say is, I don't want it to make it sound like everything about integration has been a cakewalk inside of the Apache community, despite the fact that women have been flying Apache since the 90s, mid 90s. There was some animosity. There was some friction. Sometimes you bump up against personalities, right? The military is a melting pot of everything from all across the United States. Some people are totally fine with a woman being there, and some people have reservations. And the best thing you can do is go out every day and do your job to the best of your abilities and bring everybody home. So it's really a full spectrum of, like, there were moments where I felt so extremely appreciated, and there were moments where I felt so incredibly isolated as a woman. But I also imagine that for the gentlemen of the group who don't fit in one way or another, they also experience this. And at the end of the day, we depend on our training, on the uniform, on the codification of our ethos, of this common ground to bring us together. And I'm really proud of the United States military and the efforts that it's made to make sure that this is the experience of every single soldier.
Bridget?
Yeah, so that's such a great question about the Iliad. And so the Homeric world is a completely gendered world, and which there's a very strong distinction between men who are combatants and women who are not. And so that's a very different world. And much of the action of the Iliad primarily involves male characters, but there are actually brief but very important and memorable moments involving women in the Iliad. In terms of the sort of question of the treatment of dead bodies, of course, women aren't involved in that immediate effort of recovery. But once the body is recovered, women play a very important role. And throughout Greek culture, it was women who washed the bodies of the dead and prepared them for burial. And then women have a particularly powerful role in lamentation. And lamentation is a poetic form that is kind of integrated into the Iliad. So in fact, as I mentioned, the Iliad ends with the funeral of Hector. And so at the very end of the poem, you hear three women, his mother, his wife, and Helen of Troy, mourning Hector and talking about him. So they play a really crucial role there. I'll also say that in some of those glimpses of women and those accounts of women's experiences that you get in the Iliad, you'll also see a somewhat different perspective on warfare, that women are more distanced from it. When Hector's wife is mourning him, she's she's deeply sorrowful, but she's also a little angry about the fact that he's died, left her behind, and she's going to be forever enslaved. And there's a very poignant moment in the Iliad where Andromache, Hector's wife, tries to prevent him from going out and fighting in the front lines of battle. She says, "Why can't you, pull back, fight defensively?" And his answer actually has to do with his training. He says, I can't. I hear what you're saying, but I can't, because I have been trained always to fight in the forefront of battle. So the Iliad, I think, both shows us women participating in the process of honoring and mourning the dead, but also maybe giving a somewhat different perspective on the culture of warfare.
I got a comment and a perspective on the issue. So when I had my first command as a captain was in 1979. Women were not allowed in certain portions of the military, verboten. But as a captain battery commander, I started my command with no women. At the end of it, the Army had made a decision to integrate women at the brigade headquarters in the field artillery. And I had 14 women when I turned over command. Interesting cultural time in our society difference. Example, we're at the firing range. I had one of my females at the range in a hole, zeroing her weapon to qualify for marksmanship. She was very short. She was down in a hole that she could stand on sandbags to shoot the weapon. And it came time to get out of the hole. And she said, "Somebody give me a hand." And all the men jumped up and ran over to her. And I said, "Get back in your holes." I mean, equality also brings responsibility. At that point in time, the social behavior of those young people was, "I'm a woman, I need some help," and all the men ran over. And it's like, everybody's got to pull their weight here. Get yourself out of that yourself, and you guys get back over here. Come forward to now, I'd be interested to hear your experience. You touched on it briefly, but we went from a military with very little integration of women in specialties and being exposed to combat to a situation now of women in essentially every field that we have, and therefore being exposed to in any and all situations that the military may be put against.
I'm really proud to report that when women have been faced in these situations, they do rise to the occasion. And I think culturally in America, you can see that maybe in the beginning, women hadn't had certain experiences that would have made them as successful. For example, when we look at Title IX sports and opportunities for women to be involved in athletics. And now, I mean, like, women's sports are phenomenal. We've got a lot of really amazing athletes at the professional level, and that culture of youth sports that's brought behind it is women who are very physically capable and excited to do the job. And I'm blanking on who it was. I believe it was a senior leader in the Marine Corps who just the other week was posting on Instagram. I don't have Instagram, but it's still cool. And he was saying, like, this young Lance Corporal in the Marine Corps was phenomenally talented and could do her job. And in the face of an all volunteer military, 10 years ago, the role that she currently holds would not have been open to her, and the military would have lost out on that talent. So I think it's one of those things where if you build it, they will come. If you open the gates, there will be people who rise to the occasion. Not all women will be successful in all of these roles, the same way that not all men will be successful in all of these roles. And it's really up to the individual to make sure that their fitness level is at the right place to do the role that they're taking on in the military, and in the military to provide amazing training to make sure that they're qualified in doing their job.
Mhm.
And I just really quickly, like, I'd heard those stories about, oh, the men will run to the woman if she's hurt. Interesting statistic that my medic shared with me is that women on the battlefield are actually more likely to die of chest wounds than their male counterparts because there is a sensitivity to cutting off their tops. So cutting through the shirt, cutting through the sports bra and exposing your chest made some men hesitant. And, I would say my medics wouldn't have. I have some personal experience, not in a gunshot wound, but my medics had no problem cutting my shirt off, and I was a little upset about that. 'Cause I thought it was unnecessary.
Wow, we could go all kinds of places with that. So, but the point I'd like to make is back then, even for Jessica, there wasn't one woman as a cadet at West Point. Jessica, when did the first female graduate of West Point occur? Do you recall?
My father was in the first class with women.
Okay, but he was a man, right?
Was.
Okay.
So Mark, you had a question or do you?
Yes, thank you, everybody. So my question is more, I guess, kind of top down or future looking. And I was trying to think of how to word this for a while. And Colonel Matthews, I think you said something about the luxury of having a long engagement range in some context. You don't have that in an urban context. And so that kind of made me frame this, I guess, thinking about moving forward. If you had asked me 3 years ago, maybe out of optimism or naivety, I would have said that, peer and near peer, large scale warfare was mostly a thing in the past. Obviously, having whiplash about that now. And to what degree is the kind of record setting casualty WIA versus KIA statistics that the US has had over the past 20 years something that has been a luxury of the counterinsurgency context? And how do these kinds of ideas and the ethos in the military around recovering wounded and killed, how does that contextually transition into a place of more stretched resources, a contested airspace, just more difficulty, I guess?
Well, you're trained to fight in any environment, and so you try to train in all environments. But your question was trying to get at where we are now in modern warfare and the potential capabilities of our adversaries. We are you referring to? I don't want to get into the national defense strategy, but
no, but mostly like so. The rate at which, I guess, you look at the casualty ratios of wounded versus killed we've had over the past 20 years or so, and you compare it to like a modern near peer conflict like the Russian-Ukrainian situation now, where they have maybe like between 3 and 4 wounded to killed, wounded per soldier killed. And I think the US was having ratios somewhere around like 7 or 8 plus wounded per killed in the counterinsurgency context. And how do these kind of very mission-oriented recovery opportunities and the kind of really successful pursuit of driving that ratio, how do they adapt in a situation where there's more constrained resources? How do you take an ethos of no soldier left behind and move it into a place where the enemy has more capabilities and suddenly you can't just call in a casualty evacuation helicopter anytime there's one individual wounded?
Sure. I think you just have to adapt to the situation. I mean, you could have a peer-on-peer fight and it'll be one long distance. So you will have casualties come out of nowhere when weapon systems go long distances. You will have many, many, many more casualties if you're going to have a sophisticated nation with sophisticated systems attacking somebody else with the same. We haven't seen that lately. All right. So hopefully we won't. But if you want to take Russia, Ukraine, there is a convergence of the use of technology on the battlefield that we haven't seen before. Ingenuity. You can take a quadcopter made in somebody's garage, and they are, with a grenade on it, fly it out over top of one location and drop it on somebody's head. Then you can have sophisticated missiles going hundreds of miles to hit another exact location. So there is a a use when given the situation, combat, in that case, of utilizing any and all technology in the most savvy and efficient way you can come up with at the time. And that's going on right now.
And if I could add to that really quickly, Max, like, necessity is the mother of all invention, right? So every time that a new and nasty way is devised to kill people, a new way to save people is implemented, right? We think about World War I and all of a sudden widespread use of machine guns and all sorts of different technology and a speed to battle that we hadn't previously seen before. And now we encounter the first time American forces wear helmets in battle, because prior to that, Americans weren't wearing helmets. And you think about in the beginning of the Iraq War with soft-sided Humvees, and that very quickly changed to all up armor vehicles, right? Because as America and any military encounters a technology that can destroy, kill, maim, there will be an equal effort to preserve life and defeat that technology. So I think it's interesting time. I don't want to call it the Wild West, but there will always be this technology to kill, technology to save kind of escalation that goes on, and only time will tell all the things that get brought to bear.
All right, so we're getting to the top of the hour. And so my question is, can the three of you talk a little bit about what motivates you? What motivated you to participate today? And particularly for you, Tom, I mean, you've talked about Mogadishu multiple times. I'm curious what motivates you to continue talking about that battle, particularly for us civilians, but in general.
Well, just as an aside, I was also one of the military technical advisors on the movie Black Hawk Down for a strange set of circumstances. But I think to answer your question, the movie has kept it alive. You know, very, very few people, you'd have to be a certain age to remember the actual fight in 1993. If you had personal recollection, okay, then the next group of people may have read the book, but invariably, if I'm in the crowd and I go through that and saying, how many of you have seen the movie? Boom, all the hands go up. So the movie has become the reality. And for whatever reason, the movie has resonated and has kept that subject and that issue alive. And it, as was mentioned in the comments, it's one of the top 10 movies of all time. So that component and that dynamic, plus I think the acting, and I would just add too, that there was a guy out of Delta Force who happened to be available as an advisor to Ridley Scott on the movie. I was the aviation commander. I was available to do it. I had just retired from the military, strange timing sequence. And here's the other part, because the Secretary of Defense at the time was looking to have Hollywood portray the military in a very positive manner. He supported the making of the movie by sending, so you look at that movie, the guys fast roping out of the Black Hawks are real Rangers out of the Ranger unit at that time in 1993. The helicopters are from the 160th. They were given deployment orders to go from their home station to Morocco to assist in making the filming of that movie. And in fact, if there's a scene, you see the little bird and that picture painting that was up there that was just commissioned this year. The pilot who was outside that aircraft carrying a guy over his shoulder firing a pistol at the same time, which is the way it happened. He happened to be on the standby crews that were required to go to Morocco to make the movie. He is, if you see the movie, the guy that gets out and gets those guys and get back in, that's what he really did in real life. He hated having to do that for the movie. But he was on the crew that was on standby that was told to deploy to support that movie. So all that is to say we had a level of realism in the execution of the profile of the mission that is really unusual. That doesn't happen. You have actors and civilian aircraft and things try to make war movies. You don't normally have Top Gun helped an awful lot. You know, they use real aircraft, real crews, but if you can put that amount of realism into the replication of the situation, then it probably has a staying power that lasts much longer.
Bridget?
I'm always happy to engage in this kind of dialogue between the ancient and the modern, and I always learn a huge amount from it. So it wasn't hard to want to be part of this program. But I think probably, you know, where the sort of interest really comes from me, I mean, it goes back to what Colonel Matthews was saying about, in the conversation we had before, about how at a certain point in the Battle of Mogadishu, recovering the bodies became the mission. And it is so interesting to me how many plots, and this is what I was saying earlier, how many plots of works of Greek literature come to, it's not just that treating bodies properly or recovering bodies is an important cultural value that sort of crops up in these texts. It's that this becomes the central focus of the plot. And you have these only a handful of surviving plays by the tragedian Sophocles, but two of them really center on this issue: what should happen to a body, and the fact that it can become a matter of dispute and debate, as it does in Greek literature, just sort of highlights what a really compelling issue this is. And so that is part of why I found this so interesting.
Well, one other thought, sorry, but the guys could have gotten out of there by various means at the time of the shoot down. When they got to the site, we probably could have figured some way to leave. We couldn't leave. My one pilot's body was so severely wedged in the wreckage that they couldn't get him out. At that point, nobody's going anywhere, not until we get that body out. So we hunkered down with 99 guys in that perimeter until we could accomplish that mission. Once that was accomplished, we came out.
Jessica?
I think for me, the reason I agree and really do enjoy getting these opportunities to connect is I think it's important for each generation's perspective to be captured. I think I personally feel a responsibility to make sure the memories of those who we lost on my missions is remembered and valued and honored in some way. I've connected with some of the families or some of the communities where people have been lost, and I found that to be extremely personally healing and valuable. Ultimately, as well, I feel a responsibility for, like I said, this generation, but the kind of perspective that I get to bring to it. So as a woman in a very male-dominated area, I think I bring a unique perspective that I like to share. My family will tell you I have the gift of gab, but don't shut up. So I find myself with bottomless stories to share with you, which I found that a lot of people appreciate, because some of my peers are a little bit more tight-lipped about that and perhaps wouldn't be willing to share. I cried on the ramp. I cried on the ramp. I cried on the ramp, and I cried with my entire task force that was there on the ramp with me, but I don't know that they would tell you that they cried. So for me, I feel just a very strong responsibility to speak about our experiences in this generation and to give people anchor points for if you have veterans in your life that you're not sure about how to speak to or reach, or even have like a very gentle connection with around their service. I hope I can be an anchor point of like, oh, I heard this veteran talk about blah, 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 blah. Do you agree or disagree? A lot of veterans will have their own opinion. People may disagree with me, but it's at least an anchor point for people to start that conversation from and hopefully learn from each other. And at the end of the day, I feel a lot better getting to come out and talk about my experiences. It means that it didn't happen in a vacuum. It means something and it lives on. And the efforts of everybody that went out to my left and my right to make sure that all of us came back are honored.
Well, I want to thank each of you for such a wonderful and profound discussion of this, imperative. That's really the only word I can think of to describe it. And so can we get a round of applause for everyone who talked today? And so I want to invite folks to come and visit the museum, to learn a little bit about the ancient world and to also learn a little bit about the modern world. There's a number of artifacts from Somalia, as well as the amazing Greek gallery that are on display. And then I want to encourage you also to check out the Eternal Soldier website, where you can learn a little bit more about some of these questions between the ancient world and the modern world and how they impact each other. Thank you all for coming today.